This is the Good Pod Guide, where I, Lauren Windle, listener of a million podcasts, let you know what to spend your commute listening to. Think of me as the Simon Cowell of podcasts, or at the very least, the Paula Abdul. Scandinavia is the home of so much. We've got the saffron bread, those weird salty licorice sweets, IKEA, crayfish, IKEA meatballs with gravy and cranberry sauce. Actually, come to think of it, when you look at that list, they are quite specifically Swedish. So I maybe need to learn more about Finnish and Norwegian culture. Unless those things are across Scandinavia, or is that possibly offensive to my Scandinavian friends? I feel like I may have overstepped it, like the time I asked a Greek person if kebabs were Turkish. So apologies in advance if I have upset your nation with my lack of cultural knowledge. But anyway, this is the ideal time for me to expand my understanding of Norway, at least, because we're talking about Death in Ice Valley. This is a story podcast that talks you through a famous unsolved Norwegian murder case. It happened in the 70s in Ice Valley. Basically, this woman was found dead there under very bizarre circumstances. It was an incredibly remote location with no real reason for her to be there at all. And she had all the labels cut out of her clothes and all the brand names scratched off the products she was using, like water bottles and things. They never identified her body, so she has been famously referred to as the Isdal woman, which means Ice Valley in Norwegian. This podcast is a collaboration between BBC's Neil McCarthy and the Norway public broadcaster NRK and their journalist Marie Hickgraf. What's unique about this is that the first episode, when they sort of talk you through the crime, I kind of felt like, well, what's the point? Like, there were no leads. It's such a cold case. It didn't feel like there was anything worth investigating that hadn't already been investigated. Like, it was all just going to come up with dead ends, but they slowly find just a tiny thing that they can claw into to use as a foothold to move the story forward. So actually, it always feels like all's lost, but there's always something new to learn, which is quite interesting. One line I particularly liked was when they interviewed an officer about how to identify bodies that they find. And they said, well, usually it's really easy because somebody is reported missing. But in this case, there were no missing person reports filed that corresponded. So it kind of begs the question, like, surely someone knew her, someone missed her in her life. I also enjoy how the makers of this podcast tried to use the power of podcasting and the podcast listeners to develop and solve this 47-year-old crime. If you do want to follow the developments and get involved, you're kind of a little late because it was broadcast in 2018, and that's when most of the action was kicking off. But there is a Facebook group with more than 33,000 members in it where the discussion rages on. Last time I checked, there had been comments on the forum within the last few days. So as people are finding this podcast and listening to it, they're also joining the discussion. They did also record a special live episode a year after the podcast was released to share developments and things that have been brought to their attention by listeners. One listener actually went to the crime scene to do some, private investigating and found something new that hadn't been spotted before. Also, one person had this sort of dark family secret that they uncovered, which was relevant to the investigation too. So there's some really interesting stuff there. There are 11 episodes in total. They're just over half an hour, apart from the final special live episode, which is an hour 15. So they're not long. It's not the same time commitment as some of the other narrative podcasts that we've recommended. This is a great podcast, but there's always a but. Elements of it feel a little bit like showmanship rather than journalism. Like, they interview a popular Norwegian crime writer just about sort of crime, and he doesn't have any personal connection to the case. He knows as much as anyone who's read the newspaper, and it felt like they were sort of doing that for the razzle dazzle rather than because it's actually massively relevant, because obviously he didn't have any insight to add. There's also a lot of that kind of deep, haunting, stage setting music. But you know what? Actually, they created something in the hope that it would, bring to light an old case and potentially shed new light on it, but also to entertain. And if they want to inject those kind of elements to make it entertaining, then maybe that's fine. In the next episode, I tell you why I've never taken the Mensa test, and we chat about the podcast Intelligence Squared. We've put all you need to know about the show on our website, www.goodpodguide.com, so go and check that out. You can also follow us on @goodpodguide on Instagram and Twitter.